Hello, and welcome to the Port of Los Angeles April Media Briefing. I'm Philip Sanfield, the Port's Communications Director. I'm joined, as always, by Executive Director Gene Seroka. Good morning, Gene.
Hello, Philip, and welcome, everyone. We have an exciting event planned for today with lots to discuss. And in a few moments, we'll be joined by a very distinguished guest. Ann Neuberger is the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology. She's also the Deputy Assistant to President Biden. Ann will share valuable insights on a range of topics, including the President's recent executive order to strengthen cybersecurity at U.S. ports. After our conversation, we'll take your questions. Before we begin, I'd like to address the tragic events that took place in Baltimore on March 26th. First and foremost, our thoughts and prayers continue to be with the families, friends, and colleagues of those who have perished and those who are still missing. Our hearts are with you. We'd like to offer our thanks to all the first responders who courageously risked their own lives during the rescue and recovery operations and are now aiding in the cleanup efforts. Secondly, we're deeply concerned about the businesses, the workforce, and the many people who are experiencing a severe economic impact because of this incident. Fortunately, federal, state, and local officials are doing everything possible to minimize the hardship and provide assistance where needed. Maryland Governor Wes Moore and Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott have been tireless in their efforts, not only to support the families of those impacted, but to get the city of Baltimore and its great port back up and running. My counterpart, Executive Director Jonathan Daniels, is a good friend of ours on so many levels. We continue to offer our outreach and support to his team and him as they work around the clock to restore operations. And of course, we're all so grateful to President Biden and Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg for their all-out federal response during this time. The administration has expressed its unwavering commitment to help Baltimore rebuild this critical bridge as soon as possible. This week, a 450-ton section of the bridge was cleared by one of the largest waterborne cranes on the East Coast. For perspective, that's the weight of nearly 2 Statues of Liberty. Finally, despite some disruptions, our nation's supply chain and its leaders have once again demonstrated our resiliency. Nearby ports and other stakeholders are actively stepping up to minimize the impact of this national disaster. While a full investigation will take time, I'm confident it will yield valuable lessons that can be applied to enhance safety and security on our waterways across the nation.
Thank you, Gene, for sharing your insights on that unfortunate incident. Now, before we introduce today's guest, would you please give us an overview of March cargo volume and LA's first quarter performance?
Happy to, Philip. The Port of Los Angeles ended quarter one on a high note. In March alone, we handled 743,000 20-foot equivalent units. That's a 19% improvement over last March and marks the 8th consecutive month of year-on-year growth. Looking at the first quarter as a whole, the numbers get even better. Los Angeles processed 2.4 million TEUs in Q1, a 30% spike over 2023's slow start. This is the third best opening in our port's history. Like the previous 2 months, March showed year-over-year improvements across all categories. Imports totaled 380,000 TEUs, marking a 19% jump over this time last year. It's worth noting that the National Retail Federation's Global Port Tracker is now projecting an 11% increase in U.S. imports during the first half of 2024. That's an encouraging sign. And the news gets better on the export side. March saw our best month since January of 2020. We moved 145,000 outbound TEUs, which is a 47% increase over last year. For American goods headed overseas, this marks 10 straight months of year-on-year gains. Currently, we bring in 2.6 import boxes for every export. That's a tremendous improvement over 2021, when we hit a trade imbalance of 6.2 imports to every 1 export. Ideally, our goal is to further boost American exports and get closer to a 2-to-1 ratio. Meanwhile, we sent 219,000 MTTEUs back across the Pacific, 7% more than a year ago, prepping us for strong imports in the months ahead. As we look toward April, it should be another busy month at the port, with cargo volume exceeding 700,000 TEUs in the heart of our slack season. Moving into summer and then traditional peak shipping season, I expect healthy cargo flow to continue here in Los Angeles. And that's due to the same factors I've previously mentioned: a high level of confidence in the gateway, the ability to handle more cargo efficiently, and we're currently running at about 75% of historical capacity. Perhaps the most important fact is the overall U.S. economy, and its indicators remain positive. Even with some uncertainty regarding interest rates and the latest inflation data, the job market remains exceptionally strong. U.S. employers added more than 300,000 jobs in March, much more than analysts were expecting. And Monday's Commerce Department data showed that retail sales surged 0.7% in March compared to the previous month. That's more than double what Wall Street experts predicted. This is very good news because resilient consumer spending is key to our nation's GDP growth. A strong job market and continued consumer spending will help drive cargo in the second quarter.
Thank you, Gene. And now, would you please introduce our guest?
It's my pleasure, Philip. Today, we're honored to welcome Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger. Ann is an expert with over 25 years of experience in cybersecurity, digital innovation, and emerging technologies in both the private and public sectors. As Deputy Advisor to President Biden, Ann plays a crucial role in coordinating interagency responses to cyber threats and engaging with U.S. allies on cyber cooperation. Ann, welcome and thanks for joining us today from our nation's capital.
It's my pleasure, Gene. Thank you very much for having me.
And let's roll right into it. We know the president's recent executive order is about the need to improve cybersecurity at U.S. ports. Would you walk us through the key components and what the EO hopes to achieve?
Absolutely. So I'll take a step back for a moment and note that we're in a period where we're seeing rising cybersecurity attacks from countries and criminals alike. Notably, criminals have conducted almost 5,000 ransomware attacks around the world, and those are impacting infrastructure, including port infrastructure, such as the port of Nagoya in Japan. So President Biden's approach has been to say we really need to lock our digital doors, ensure that cybersecurity practices are put in place by critical services, from ports to water systems to power systems, to ensure that those successful attacks can't happen. The executive order was a good example of that, in this case for ports, due to the important economic impact, and in terms of the role from a national security perspective as well. We deploy our military from our commercial ports, as you know well. So as a result, this executive order really gives the Coast Guard the authority to set minimum cybersecurity practices at ports, to turn away ships where there is a concern that they may pose a cybersecurity risk, to offer support to ports as well, to institute mandatory reporting of cyber incidents so we get a picture of threats at ports, as well as the authority for the Coast Guard to respond to malicious cyber incidents at ports, to offer support and to ensure that the resources of the U.S. government are available to accelerate recovery.
Good perspective and a lot to take in there. Also, Ann, your work is complex. Ransomware, cyber attacks, the rise of AI technology, and so many other issues. What are you and your office focused on today?
To your point, cybersecurity and really protecting the nation's critical services from cyber attacks is our top priority overall. In addition, as the president has talked about, AI offers both a great deal of promise and peril. On the promise side, AI can, for example, scan code, potentially to help us identify vulnerabilities more quickly. On the peril side, it can be used to accelerate development of malicious code by adversaries. So our goal is to ensure that AI on defense is always one step ahead. Similarly, we know that AI can be used in an education context. And you have a class full of kids each with a different learning style, potentially to help tailor learning for each child. So taking advantage of the promise while managing for some of the risks and the policies around that is an area of focus for us. In addition, issues like telecommunications, how to ensure that everybody in America has access to fast, available telecom, whether it's a child remote studying or a company or people working for a company, as well as the security of that telecommunications. Quantum is a key area as well as we look to a next generation of cryptography. There's any number of areas of emerging technology that we seek to focus on the national security risks and to put in place policies to manage those.
So much to consider there, and that leads us back into our industry. So many Americans learned just how important the nation's supply chain is during the pandemic. Today, with more data being shared to improve efficiency, we must protect that information. From where you sit, Anne, what measures should the private sector and ports be taking now to secure their data?
I want to take a moment, Jean, to give you a shout out for the Cyber Resilience Center that you've set up at the Port of LA, because that's a really great example of how government and the private sector can work together in the context of critical services. Government sharing intelligence, sharing best practices, ensuring that the services that government makes available, like free vulnerability assessments, are being used by companies, by critical infrastructure. So remarkable work, and we think that's really a best practice, and thank you for establishing that Cyber Resilience Center, bringing in the key companies, and for the effective way in which it serves as a resource for government and private sector alike. In addition, there's a small set of high-impact cybersecurity practices that we always point to and really call on companies, particularly the companies operating critical services, to put in place. For example, encrypting data. So that, for example, even if a hack happens and data is stolen, if it's encrypted, hackers can't use it to blackmail individuals or to press companies to pay them a ransom to free that data, or to dump it on the dark web, as we've seen with any amount of sensitive school data. So encryption of data at rest and as it moves is really a priority. The second piece is rapid patching of vulnerabilities, particularly critical vulnerabilities. We're seeing the period of time that it takes adversaries to convert a 0-day or known vulnerability into attack getting shorter and shorter. So where now it can often be, in some cases, for skilled attackers, in less than a week. The defenders have to be faster than that, ensuring that they've patched. Endpoint detections, you're monitoring a network. Think of it as an alarm system for a network. And ensuring that if there is a breach, you can find it quickly before the attacker can have impact. And then things like having a trained team, a security operations center for large networks. Those are the things, of course, I would say the final multi-factor authentication, because passwords are dead. That small set of practices are high impact. And truly today, every company should have them in place. The U.S. government offers various resources to help accelerate putting that in place as well.
All good advice. And this September, the Port of Los Angeles will commemorate its 10th anniversary participating with our partner, the Department of Homeland Security, on our Cybersecurity Operations Center. All of that data collected feeds up to the City of Los Angeles, ISAC, and to the NCIC in Washington. But the story here is that last year, we stopped 750 million cyber intrusion attempts at the Port of Los Angeles. And that gave us the courage to move into that cyber resilience space, where today, with more than 24 private sector partners, we've already stopped 6 intrusion attempts to private sector interests that they didn't know were coming. A lot more to do, a lot more to learn. But with our technical staff that's ISO 27001 trained and certified, I think we're leading the way here for a conversation across the nation and throughout the world on how to better protect our ports and infrastructure. Finally, Ann, from our side, from a federal perspective, what are we doing to protect and secure government system? I'm sure there's a leadership component, discussions with our allies in addition to the technical aspects. And by the way, every day you're advising the president. How does all this come together?
That's a really great question because we need to practice what we preach in government. And certainly we have a commitment that the critical services that American citizens rely on, that government provides, will be available. And the president has really made cybersecurity a priority from day one. Shortly after he took office in January and May, the president released Executive Order 14028, which set significant cybersecurity requirements across the federal government. Actually, each of the practices I talked about a moment ago: encrypting data, deploying multi-factor authentication. And here at the White House, we track that fully in terms of implementation to ensure that where the rubber meets the road, those results are put in place. In fact, one of the most high impact aspects of the president's executive order will go live in June. It's been 3 years of consistent, persistent work. And that is that companies that produce software for the U.S. government wants to attest that the software was developed meeting a secure software development standard that NIST, the National Institute for Standards, created. And this particular requirement came from lessons learned from the SolarWinds incident, where I think we all learned about the complexity of building and releasing secure software and the way attackers could compromise that process, and as a result, compromise any users, whether corporate or government, of that software. And as a result, the president's executive order tasked the National Institute for Standards to develop a secure software development standard. And since then, we've been working closely to put in place a way a way to attest for companies building software that they meet that standard. That will be an incredibly high impact step, because fundamentally, even as we seek to lock our digital doors, to patch, to monitor for intrusions, if the software running on our networks is built more securely, it's a far more defensible network.
And fascinating insights into your responsibilities, which are so important to all of us. I know you're on a tight schedule, so let's start by taking a few questions from the media and then let you return to your important work ahead. Philip, back over to you.
Thank you, Gene. If there are any media who have a question and want to enter it in the chat box, they can do so now, particularly for Ann. We do have a few questions in advance, and the first one is from Lori Ann LaRocco of CNBC. Can you discuss the status of the review of Chinese cranes? How many have been verified as safe from a cyber perspective, and is other port equipment being reviewed?
Thank you for the question. You raised the Maritime Security Directive, where one part of this port's effort has been addressing the presence of Chinese cranes and the remote access that could provide to disrupt the operations of a port during a crisis or a conflict. The Coast Guard is actually doing that investigation, so I'll refer you to them for the details of it. But I'll note one exciting part of this effort as well, which was bringing back manufacturing using the bipartisan infrastructure law that Congress passed under the president's initiative to really that investment in ports to bring back manufacturing of cranes to the United States. A company called Pacifico actually looking at potential manufacturing in California. So that's an exciting part because trusted vendors is such a big part of cybersecurity. Technology is so complex, hardware, software, physical infrastructure like cranes. Knowing that these are trusted vendors and attracting that manufacturing back is a big part of building an overall trusted infrastructure.
Thank you. There's one more question. It's also crane related. I don't know if anyone else has a question now for Ann, but if they do, I'd like to get it now. This is from Paul Avery of World Cargo News. Can you outline the new steps that owners of port cranes manufactured in China must follow under the executive order?
I'm sorry. I missed. Can we outline the specifics that they have to follow under the executive order?
Yeah, any specifics about the port cranes being manufactured in China?
So first, those apply to any crane, to be clear, because we want to ensure that a cybersecurity standard is met whether a crane is manufactured in China, Europe, or in the future, the United States. The importance of security and critical infrastructure applies to all. That notice of proposed rulemaking, which was released as part of this, details some of the potential security requirements. It's a process we use to get input from companies from the private sector, and the Coast Guard will be receiving that input on its notice of proposed rulemaking and then finalizing the cybersecurity requirements that need to be met.
Very good. We did just get one more question in here, and this is from Eric Geller, and he's asking, can you talk about the results of the recent Department of Homeland Security Supply Chain Resilience Center tabletop exercise related to cybersecurity of cranes? What findings were encouraging and which ones concerned you?
I'm again going to refer to the Department of Homeland Security since that was their tabletop exercise, and they'd be the ones to kind of give a detailed briefing on what it found. Really, the purpose of this discussion was to lift up the overall executive order, the fact that the Coast Guard now has the authority to assist ports in the event of a cyber incident to prevent a ship which might be presenting a cybersecurity risk, as well as releasing a notice of proposed rulemaking to set in place the cybersecurity requirements for ports to ensure that they've locked their digital doors and become harder targets for both the countries and criminals who we know seek to target and compromise critical infrastructure in the United States and, frankly, around the world each day.
Thank you so much for that. Jean, I'm going to turn it back to you before we return with some cargo-related inquiries for you.
Thanks, Philip. And really appreciate you joining us today, as well as all of your work to protect the security and interests of the United States.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Philip. An honor to be with you, and my thanks for all you do each day to keep the ports of America and a very specific part of America safe.
Much appreciated. Philip, back over to you. Do we have more questions in the queue?
Yes, we do, Jean. But before we get to that, can you share a quick rundown on your latest swing through Asia a few weeks ago?
Yeah, sure, Philip. I embarked on a trip the afternoon of Easter Sunday to begin business meetings through Singapore, Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and Hong Kong, all in an effort to bring more cargo our way. I had the privilege of meeting with about 350 supply chain stakeholders and others who work with us here at the Port of Los Angeles. I was honored to participate with the BNSF Railways Asia Customer Forum, led by our friend, Steve Bobb. We discussed West Coast initiatives, how we bring more cargo here, and specifically the intermodal rail efforts the BNSF is leading. Most of the work in this area is so important because the market share that's eroded from the Port of Los Angeles and other West Coast ports over the past 2 decades has been that intact ocean box that comes here from Asia and moves by rail to more than 14 different distribution centers throughout the country. We've got to get sharper, put our prices in perspective with what's needed in the marketplace, and get out there and knock on every door possible. I'll be going back to Hong Kong this Sunday for another gathering and a supply chain stakeholder symposium with Waldo Basilia of the APL Logistics Group in Asia. This will be my 3rd trip to Asia in the first 4 months of the year. 30% of the cargo that we move through the Port of Los Angeles is controlled across the Pacific Rim, and I want to make sure customers there know that we're just as interested in bringing their products here to the United States.
All right. Thank you, Jean. We do have a few questions that have come in. If anyone else has one, please drop it into the chat box and please include your name and affiliation. Bill Mongaluzzo, Journal of Commerce, is asking, according to the JOC sister company peers, U.S. imports from Asia moving through the Port of LA in the first quarter increased almost 37% over Q1 of last year. Do you expect year-over-year imports to continue to increase at strong double-digit rates through the 2024 peak season?
Thanks for the question, Bill, and good to have you with us again this month. I see this being a good year in 2024 because of the reasons I mentioned, the economy, a long-term dock workers contract, and unfortunately, the security issues in the Red Sea, the drought in the Panama Canal, and a self-imposed deadline on the dock workers negotiations along the East Coast. But please remember, Q1 last year in 2023 was an exceptionally slow start to the year for a variety of reasons. High inventory across the United States, both retail as well as manufacturing, parts and components, a lingering dock worker contract on our coast that wound up going for 13 months of negotiations before acting Labor Secretary Julie Su helped the size reach the goal line, and a variety of other economic issues, including those high interest rates and the high inflation levels. But what we've seen now to the start of the year is this economy keeps on cooking. And with those other issues, we'll have good import levels. And I'm so impressed by the industry collaboration on pushing those exports to new highs. We won't see the cartoon-like year-over-year gains like that 37% you note, but as we start heading into the second quarter, traditional slack season, we'll see a good bump. And then remember that we reached a tentative agreement at about the same time the AgTC was holding their annual meeting up in Tacoma in June, and then ratification took place in August. That's when the cargo really started picking up. So we'll see those growth rates year on year moderate, but I'm looking at pre-COVID numbers. And what we looked like on that 5-year rolling average, we're now surpassing those numbers, which tells me the cargo volume is strong. Thanks, Bill.
Next question is from Eric Watkins. Since the congestion backup in the San Pedro Bay during the first part of the pandemic, what has the Port of LA and its stakeholders done to improve the supply chain ahead of the possibility of more cargo coming here in the months ahead?
Eric, appreciate you being with us again today. The number one thing is that this port and others like it have to be used as transit facilities, not warehouses. With the benefit of hindsight, if I could look at one issue that really began this discussion around congestion, it was that some left their cargo here for elongated periods of time. And as the next ship came in, that cargo stack just kept piling up and you had no maneuverability on the terminals. What I look at every morning, and this is led by our head of public safety, Tom Gazy, and the work on the Port Optimizer, we have a dashboard of vital statistics that I evaluate. All of those stats are at or better than pre-COVID levels. Our dwell times on terminals, the dwell off-site at warehouses and storefronts, the velocity by which cargo is moving through the port, the rail capabilities, and how quickly our longshoremen and women are discharging and loading those vessels back and forth. And again, here at the Port of Los Angeles, the average vessel sees an exchange of more than 12,000 TEUs per ship call. That's the best in the business. So if we continue to see these numbers operating this way, as I talk to those importers and exporters, both here and abroad, they're telling me they're booking more cargo coming our way. We're prepared. We're at about 75% of historical capacity. And I think, to your point, what we've learned about how we move cargo and how we work together, those interdependencies across the public and private sector interests, our ceiling now is increased. Where we hit 1 million TEUs in that month of May of 2021, I see that ceiling going even higher now, our capability, our capacity. So there's more good news to come in this area, and we're learning every day. But as I've said before, I don't know what I don't know. And that's why we keep leaning on experts across a variety of interests to help make us a better port, a better operation, and better community every day. Thanks again, Eric.
Thank you, Gene. This question is from Stas, and we probably could have used the expertise of Anne on this, but it's addressed to you as well. Should U.S. This is Stas Margaronis from the American Journal of Transportation. Should U.S. ports be adopting a uniform set of protocols to defend against cyber attacks, and will federal funding be required?
Stas, thanks for joining us once again from up in the Bay Area. Always glad to have you with us. I've been campaigning for that for years. We continue to be one of the few ports here nationwide that has a robust protocol for cyber resilience. I reference Port Police Chief Tom Gazy and the work that we've done now 10 years on that CSOC, the Cybersecurity Operations Center. And in the 16, 17, 18 months now, since we co-partnered with IBM on the Cyber Resilience Center, we're already stopping crime. But more needs to be done across the country. And again, this goes not only to ports, but our crucial links within the supply chain, utilities, infrastructure projects nationwide. We saw what happened to the gas pipelines in the Southeast, and we've seen in our own industry, dating back to the NotPetya attack in Eastern Europe and how it impacted terminals right here at home. Much more to do, but I think that conversation is now elevated in and amongst us in the supply chain industry, but also now through that executive order. So I think there's more to be discussed, but also some tailwinds behind us now to get some progress happening on the ground. Thanks, Stas.
Gene, this looks to be our last question unless anyone drops one into the chat box in the next couple minutes. And it's come from a few different journalists. In light of what happened in Baltimore, is Los Angeles doing a review of its safety protocols?
We received the difficult news, Philip, on that evening of the 25th Pacific time. And launching right into this discussion with Chief Gazy, we talked about a top-to-bottom review of all these protocols, policies, safety and security measures that we have. Captain Betts is also here with us today, one of the heads of the Port Pilots Group here, City of Los Angeles, Port of Los Angeles. And if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. We've said this a million times before, but you never want a single source of failure. And that's why these protocols and policies are so important. Minimum of 2 tugs against every container ship and cargo ship that's coming into the port. The work that we do with the cruise industry will be omnipresent as that market continues to grow. And looking here at the Port of Los Angeles with the iconic Vincent Thomas Bridge, a suspension design. Its legs or stanchions are positioned on the ground in the terminal environment away from water. But there's still much more to do and much more to learn. We want to be as safe as possible for the protection of the crews, the cargo, and those vessel assets that are coming into this port day and night. We've done a really good job on safety and security across a lifetime here at the Port of Los Angeles, but there's more work ahead of us, and we want to make sure that we're leading this conversation.
Thank you, Gene. That concludes the questions. Back to you for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Philip. With Earth Day being celebrated around the world next Monday, I want to close out today reflecting on how much we all depend on a healthy, sustainable planet. As a leading force in economic development and environmental stewardship, the Port of Los Angeles has an outsized responsibility to excel in both of these areas. I'm proud of our environmental progress, including the many successes of our Clean Air Action Plan. We've had an unwavering commitment that we hold today for the work that lies ahead. You've heard me talk about our sustainability efforts on many occasions. So today, I'd like you to hear from a few of our colleagues at the port as they share what it means to be a part of this collective effort.
The history of ports throughout time used to tell a story of smokestacks and soot. But here at the Port of Los Angeles, we've been rewriting that story for decades.
Since 2006, we've been working diligently to clean the air, cutting emissions from vessel and cargo operations.
We're one of the world's leading ports in developing zero emissions technologies for loading and unloading these giant container ships.
We're the first in the world to plug container ships into shore power, so they wouldn't have to use diesel engines while in port.
And today we have one of the largest fleets of cleaner powered trucks of any port in the world.
Technology is still developing, but by 2035, our goal is for every truck and every piece of cargo handling equipment on our docks to be emission-free. And it's more than clean air, it's clean water too.
After decades of shipbuilding and industrial use, expectations of clean water in any port were low.
Not anymore. For 40 years, we've been working on water quality. Today, the birds and fish are back and marine life is thriving.
There's one more environment we've been working on, the human environment, places where you can come and enjoy the port.
We've invested millions on parks, promenades, and places to play.
Now, there are hundreds of acres of public space that hosts concerts, events, and more, with unbeatable waterfront views.
Which is why on Earth Day, we're so happy to share all the ways that we are shaping a beautiful environment here at the Port of Los
Because we don't just work here.
We live here.
LA is our city.
and this is our port.
Inspiring. What stands out to me is the human message and the importance of safeguarding our communities. This is why we work so hard for clean air and water and for a clean port. Like they said, we don't just work here, we live here. This is our City of Angels. This is our port. Thanks for joining us today. Take care, everyone, and look forward to being with you again in May.